As leaders of some of the world's richest nations gather in picturesque Cornwall, so have dozens of campaign groups that want to send a message to the Western political elite. Now, several hundred climate activists, some dressed as blackbirds as a symbol of warning, others banging drums, have gathered in St Ives. It's a stone's throw away from heavily guarded G7 summit venue at the Carbis Bay. Now, behind police cordons and layers of security, leaders from the United States, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Italy and Canada have gathered for a three-day summit. They hope it will show the West and also that they can act decisively on some of the major global issues at hand. Police have mounted a major security operation for the summit, where thousands of officers have drafted in from across Britain. Meanwhile, in Falmouth, a group of young climate activists have gathered outside the G7 Media Centre in Falmouth, as police officers say they have arrested 7 people yesterday after they found paint, smoke grenades and megaphones in a car. However, those organising some of the protests accuse the authorities of oppressive tactics. We continue with G7 coverage taking place between the 11th and 13th of June in Cornwall, England, where the role of global leaders in tackling environmental issues and climate change will also be under the spotlight. We're joined by Greenpeace climate and energy campaigner Thandile Chinyavanu for more on this story. Thandile, a very good evening and thank you for joining us. Now, we're looking at the slogan Build Back Better. These are slogans that are being echoed at the G7. Climate change, environmental issues are also under the spotlight. Now, we want to look at some of the developing instruments and approaches that need to be adopted that not only benefit advanced economies, but also the lesser developed economies. This is very crucial. My question is, what foreign and trade relations capacity is required for all to claim a stake in this investment?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. As you know, this G7 summit is quite an important fixture in geopolitics and development with regards to climate policy. And so what's most important going into this for a lot of countries is this $1 billion pledge that is at stake, that has been pledged by the G7 countries. So South Africa and many others will be looking forward to being able to secure funding to contribute towards climate adaptation and mitigation. So I think what's important for us to recognize during this time is putting forward ambitious climate targets. South Africa, as you may know, recently updated our nationally determined contributions as a part of our commitment to the Paris Agreement. And civil society and scientists alike agree that the targets that have been put forward in the updated NDC are not ambitious enough. And so one of the things that these G7 countries will be looking for is ambitious climate targets. Mm-hmm. And there are discussions that they may possibly be looking to, especially in the EU, impose a carbon border tariff that would really allow for countries that don't have any carbon taxes in place, or countries like South Africa that have very weak carbon tax mechanisms. If you don't know, South Africa's carbon tax or price of carbon in South Africa is about the same price as a cup of coffee. So they will be looking to impose these carbon tariffs that would mean that any imported goods would have a carbon price put on them.
Thandile, you've spoken about targets. You've also spoken about, achieving these targets. And like many other major meetings of world leaders, I mean, G7 summits can often be criticized as nothing more than talking shop or change. Often that's hardly ever realized. Now, what are your expectations ahead of the G7 summit, perhaps also after it's concluded?
I think what we are expecting to see as civil society is greater political will from our leaders to actually combat climate change. As it is right now, we're seeing a lot of commitment, it seems, to our fossil fuel industries, particularly companies such as Sasol and Eskom. Our government continues to support them through subsidies. And so what's important is to see our government come back with an attitude of no longer propping up fossil fuel industries and rather committing more towards a transition to a green economy, as well as through supporting the growth of adaptation and mitigation against climate change.
All right, Tandile, we're just also looking at some of the G7 leaders who've highlighted their desire to boost partnerships between them and Africa, of course, acting out in the bilateral engagements, particularly in the institutions where they hold a lot of sway. My question is, what sort of agreements are we going to be looking at after the summit?
I think it's still quite something that needs to be looked at and discussed further in terms of what could possibly come out of this. But from a civil society perspective, what's very important is that these G7 countries take a more prominent role in terms of policy when it comes to international relations with Africa, particularly fossil fuel industries. It seems that fossil fuel industries have recognized that they don't really have a viable lifespan in many of these developed countries anymore, and they have identified many African countries, as a emerging economy and a place where which they can continue these polluting and disastrous business models that they have. So it's important that our G7 leaders recognize this and really do the groundwork in making sure that these fossil fuel companies are not just finding fertile ground in Africa and polluting our environment. It's important that they recognize that we're not a dumping ground for fossil fuels.
Absolutely. Tandile, I just want to conclude perhaps by getting a reaction from you on the latest announcement by President Cyril Ramaphosa regarding renewable energy. What is your take?
Well, Greenpeace Africa welcomes the decision by the president to ease the restrictions on renewable energy generation by independent power producers. We believe that this could be a first step in really ensuring South Africa's energy security, as many of us tonight are waiting, for the impending load shedding. It would really allow for us to adopt a more secure energy system, while also allowing for us to contribute towards reducing our emissions. So one of the mechanisms that is proposed in the NDC for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions is the integrated resource plan, and this could potentially reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 84 metric tons per annum, and this is it can really exploit the potential of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions the most out of all of the mechanisms that have been proposed. So it's important that our government recognizes this and incorporate renewable energies at a more extensive rate in our IRP and allow for independent power producers to generate electricity. So I think it's a very important step, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. And our government needs to recognize the power that renewable energies has in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely. It's definitely a chance for South Africa to establish some climate diplomacy. Tandile, we're going to leave that conversation there. Thank you very much for joining us. Greenpeace Climate and Energy Campaigner Tandile Vanyu chatting about the role of global leaders in tackling environmental issues and climate change during the G7 summit.